Welcome to the very special edition of Writing Wednesday, where instead of reviewing other pieces of work, I am going to be reviewing my own and my very first paper that's published, and it's published in Sports Biomechanics. It's about impulse generation and baseball pitching. And I'm going to share a little bit about the stories behind this paper and generally what is the process like for academic publishing in general. All right, so let's get started. So generally, in academic publishing, you go from the cycle of a paper being a much starting off as a very small research project, and that typically results in what's called like a conference abstract submission. So a paper is a longer form piece of content. You can think of that way, and an abstract is like an Instagram reel. So the abstract, it's much shorter in scope and it's much more manageable for someone that's just getting into research. And as this is my first paper as a doctoral student at Stevens, that was my very first project. So the idea is, ground reaction forces has been measured in baseball pitching for a while. And the thing is, people primarily, especially if you come from a strength and conditioning background, people primarily focused on the linear and particularly just the vertical directions of ground reaction forces. From a mechanical perspective, like I've covered in many posts before, if you go to my story highlights slash mechanics, I explain that the direction, the magnitudes, and the point of origin of ground action forces are all important to understanding how the body's linear and the body's angular momentum are being controlled. And according to the impulse momentum relationship, the body's momentum is directly controlled by the net impulses applied onto the body. And those net impulses directly come from the ground action forces being applied over time, and then the moments about body center mass being applied over time. And if you're a bit more interested in that mechanics detail, that will be covered in a future episode of Mechanics Monday. Yeah, we've fallen a bit off the wagon recently, but that's how life is. So today, April Fool's Day, I'm gonna look at a paper when I was at my most foolish stage. So I remember still so vividly, like at the very beginning, the first task my professor told me to do was to understand, in the code we take the biomechanical data and then we export it from its native motion capture software format, and then we are importing into MATLAB for further data processing. We don't pay money like suckers so that other people can do the biomechanics for us. We, do hard things, right? So what we ended up doing was, we have the data and we say, okay, we know we want the forward direction to be going from the mound towards home plate. Okay, that's because, that's where you're throwing the ball. Let's see, and we expect the ground action forces to be pointed forward, right? What was so difficult that literally took me 6 weeks to figure out was like, which way is forward? Like, should the ground action force time series be going up, as at the point in the pitch that, that we expect or not? All right, so this is typically what kind of biomechanical data we are working with, okay? This is old school. Nowadays, not everybody, but a lot of people are using markerless motion capture, which means they are filming videos from multiple angles around the participants in the motion capture space, and a fancy, rarely validated, all right, and often problematic program are being used to give you directly the positions of the body's anatomic landmarks. Well, this one was done the hard way. And in my future videos, I will also tell you how I did my dissertation data collections the hard way as well. So here we attach individual markers. No, our collaborators, because this was before my time. And I guess a sidetrack for the backstory was that I came in, I wanted to study, I wanted to research two-foot running jumps. I wanted to learn about the biomechanics, the technique of two-foot running jumps. But to start, right, it's a whole process. I'll talk about it in my future future Writing Wednesday video for my first jumping paper. But it's a lot of work to set up. It's a lot of preparation. And when I came in, my professor was like, "Okay, we understand that you want to look at jumping, which is a difficult movement, but something we can do in the lab, as it turns out. Great. But we start with this baseball project because there's already data and the analysis framework of looking at the impulse from the ground action forces and how that changes the body's momentum. Well, that pretty much lines up with what we want to look at in a two-foot running jump. So why don't you get started with this baseball project? My professor did her project in dance. No, sorry. She wanted to do her dissertation project in dance, but she started with golfing. As I say, sometimes the the mechanical principles don't change for what the movements you're investigating. And if you're a curious biomechanist, all right, this is the incorrect trial, but it's called what we call anyway. Let me go back. The most important thing as a biomechanist is that you're approaching each movement rigorously and trying to understand the mechanical principles that govern how and why the way the people move the way they move. So this is actually not a pitching trial. This is what we call a static trial, and it's a way for us to establish um, what's the relationship between the key anatomical landmarks, aka the body parts, the skeletons, the bumps, the joints, that we care about their relationship with the markers that we put on. Because we can't always, for example, if we want to know what's the center of the wrist, right, anatomical center of the wrist doing, we can't actually put a marker there. So we put markers right next to the wrist, and then we capture the mathematical, well, we can assume or calculate the mathematical relationship between the markers that are positioned around the wrist joint center and the actual wrist joint center, and we retain that mathematical relationship to allow us to then reconstruct what we expect the body skeleton to be. Okay? So this is what we call static trials. That's performed at the very beginning to establish those anatomical relationships. And bang, all right. So now we have the participant walking onto the force plate. That's almost always problematic and broken. And at this stage in time, the syncing of the force plates with the motion capture data is not great. And I remember still, my very first task was like, okay, figure out which direction should positive be, right? Then you look at, okay, for the x-axis is pointed back. Now I'm walking through quite quickly, but let's see how many people will actually understand this part. So the global x-axis is pointed backwards because we know that this is starting from gosh, I think it's a stretch or a wind up. Don't kill me, Marlins. But okay. Anyway, you start facing sideways, but the objective is to pitch the ball, down the mound, right, towards the left side on the screen. And her question was like, okay, if the body needs to move forward in the direction of the pitch, which way should the ground action force point to? Well, obviously it should point forward. So if the global definitions of directions are that backward is positive, well, the ground action forces at this time point in this component direction has to be negative. So was it negative? It certainly wasn't, and it took, a very long time to figure out, and that's because with one thing we realized is like we changed the way we define forward. So this sort of ties in to one of my previous posts about how important directions is. And coming from an engineering background from Oxford of all places, I was a little bit rusty with my vector algebra and coordinate systems. And to be frank, I think I only truly grasped the mathematics and the principles behind it years into my PhD. Like nowadays, I look at it, I'll be like, dang, it took me, 6 weeks to figure out whether this should be positive or negative. But, those 6 weeks sort of shaped the way I am today. So going back to the abstracts part, I started off with that was the pandemic year as well. So I had a couple of virtual conferences. So the first abstract I did was with the International Society of Biomechanics Conference, ISB. We rolled it up right here. Here's the impulses generated. And then we wrote up a second abstract that's kind of similar, but touches on a different aspect of the mechanics. And we submitted it to American Society of Biomechanics, ASB, and I actually got rejected, which is crazy. Like it's the first and only time one of my abstracts is rejected by a conference, and I become a shining example of when they say, "Hey, we are a academically rigorous conference." But the primary problem with this kind of research and this kind of mechanical analysis is like the terminology is so important in trying to explain what's happening because people are typically very familiar and very comfortable with the classic anatomical positions, anatomical planes of sagittal, frontal, transverse, right? And we're trying to bridge a gap between describing the objectives of the movement as it happens in the global space, meaning there is a forward direction of our body trying to move and the ball trying to move that explicitly defines the successes and failures of the pitching movement, and there are associated rotations in those directions that contribute to it. But those planes aren't inherently or are not necessarily or have no business needing to be aligned with the anatomical planes. The body uses whatever strategies is needed in whatever planes is needed to complete the task. So the problem is, in trying to describe these sort of moments, and in later years, we found other papers that are describing similar things, but back then we had a lot of trouble in trying to understand and best describe this. And what's funny is like this and quite a few of my later works ended up being a combination of just a standard research paper as well as a educational piece on mechanics. Okay, let's talk about we have a few abstract submissions. One was rejected. One, I literally was like in a Zoom session and we recorded like a video explaining the research. Like one person came in, asked a non-related question, and then left, and then that was the entirety of the virtual poster session. But funnily enough, in at the same year, we also submitted this conference in a slightly longer format to International Society of Biomechanics in Sport, where I actually got selected to be part of the New Investigator Award. I was like, oh, great. I'm a first year PhD student, right? We must all be new investigators in science. It was again virtual. That was the one in Sydney. And I did it in like a Saturday afternoon. I wore like the best shirt I could find, which is no, the formal shirt. I was so nervous. That video is still on YouTube somewhere actually. One day I'm actually gonna scrub it and then upload it onto my YouTube channel. But anyway, so nervous. I didn't win it. The person that went right before me ended up winning it all. And it was years later that I realized that new investigators are literally all PhD students who's ready to graduate. So I have no idea how my work in my first year actually ended up being chosen. But that showed they had some potential, right? So I was like, okay, we had a 4-page paper that expands our initial abstracts a little bit further, explains the mechanics a little bit further, and then let's keep cracking on. So we tried to turn that into a paper, and that was initially submitted to Journals of Biomechanics. Okay, I'm dropping all the names. Okay, I am dropping all the names. Anyway, so the idea is even if we're writing papers, there are different kinds of papers that can happen. You can have reviews which are written, organized, and dealt with differently than original research paper, and you can have like commentaries and higher level like systematic reviews, meta-analysis, etc., etc., etc. And the thing is, people often treat each different papers as the same. I mean, even though yes, people are acknowledging there are different tiers of evidence, but even from like a purely how academia works perspective, different papers are handled and organized differently. And then there's what we tried the first time around, which was the short communication paper. So it's intentionally short. It's between a long form content and a reel. So I'll say it's one of those reels where you kind of just went on and babble for like 7 minutes, and then you're like it kind of sits, nowhere in between. But anyway, the idea is we tried our best explaining the mechanics and stuff. Rejected, all right. And I was so sad to the fact that I made like a folder called post rejection docs, like like it's a love letter or something. But anyway, the idea is, was one of the favorite complaints were like, oh gosh, okay, some of the reviewer stuff. What's nice is the reviewer identities are normalized. Yeah, I kind of wrote like a line by line, not like a rebuttal, but like an argumentative, like screw you after each of the points. But the idea is, we tried and it didn't work. So what we ended up doing was we again repackaged it. We add a whole new figure, and that's what we saw here in the very first figure. And we're like, God damn it, we gotta explain what is this mechanics. And we're using my least favorite way to define directions, which is using letters. Like I really don't like fixating letters with specific directions. I think you are sort of stepping back from the true functional objectives of the movements, and you are simplifying math by going back to algebra, but to me, I think you're losing clarity in like communicating the mechanics, the directions, the meaning of the movement. That's why I always stick to like, forward, vertical, etc., etc., etc. Forward, vertical, leftward, and you define those forward, vertical, leftward with respect to your movements of interest. But here's the core deal with this paper. Linear impulse, super easy to calculate. You have your ground action force time series, you integrate over time, you have your linear impulse. Anybody with their Hawking dynamics force plate already has that metric. Here's the next layer, okay? Remember what I mentioned about the effects of ground action forces and how important the directions are? Well, their directions relative to the body center mass controls the direction of rotation for your body center mass. So the idea is when you have a ground action forces that's at a distance or a moment r and an angle away from pointing at your body center mass, it has a tendency to create a rotation. So that's how your body can create rotation. Think about the sort of movement you see in a spin move in a basketball court, a cartwheel, even something like a standing from or back somersault, flip. Ground action forces has to be pointed away from your body center mass first for a period of time in order for you to generate that rotation. The mechanically proper way is that you have to create a moment from your ground action forces over time which gives you angular impulse, and that angular impulse increases your body's angular momentum, and your angular momentum is what quantifies the amount or degree of rotation for your body. That's the whole linear impulse momentum relationship, but in the angular domain. And we are looking at how are moments being generated by each leg's forces around the body center mass in order to create that rotation. And we can so let's talk about some of the figure making. Oh, I even give out the full, equation here, right? We fully define everything like it's a textbook, and it's a habit that I've kept. I'm working on one baseball paper methods paper right now, and I have a lot of equations, and the idea is to better explain this concept because we can find some of this in specific engineering textbooks. Obviously, it's like I look back to my second year uh, mechanics classes at Oxford. It was right there. It's one of the slides. I was trying to make the first team in basketball, so that year was a bit crazy. I was trying too hard. I wasn't passing the ball. I wasn't sharing the ball. I did get like my career high 25 points in a loss, and then the next week I got benched. But anyway, so not the best year of academics, but I was decent at basketball that year, regardless. Okay, anyway. Time series. It's one of my favorite features. Time series, time series alongside figurines of the body. You're showing the data, how it changes over time. You're showing real data, example data, right? And you are getting a sense of, okay, here's what the body looks like. To me, that's always the thing I'm going to be requesting any sort of papers if it comes across my reviewer desk, which is a few, but I've got some. And the idea is, you have your ground action forces, right? And you have the ground action forces in again each of the directions. I think we chose XYZ in this case, so it's easier for people to grasp. In future researches, I did try really hard to make sure I'm using what I prefer, the preferred directions, right? The more mechanically relevant directions. Not anatomical, sadly, because if you just look at what's happening here, you realize, oh wow, the body's sagittal plane is rotating through space. So using sagittal plane strictly is not appropriate, and that's actually a problem in a lot of walking and turning research. Most of walking research are in straight line walking. So in the case of turning, again, you have the body's anatomical plane that's slightly rotating. If you define it based on the trunk or the pelvis, those planes are going to be offset from one another, right? So again, don't get married to the anatomical planes. Get married to the game. All right, anyway. So we have our time series, right, to explain, okay, for the moments about body center mass, here's what it looks like. We have the back leg generating a fairly large amount, and that's what that happens when the forward propulsive forces from the back leg has dropped. And that's because, according to the vector algebra, When your ground reaction forces is directed very closely straight to your body center of mass, it's not going to create as big of a moment if this angle is really small, because it's all a matter of this product here. If the angle theta, meaning the ground action forces, is almost pointed right at your body center mass, this angle sine angle theta is going to be very small. So it doesn't matter as much how big your forces are or how far away the legs are, right? The moments created are just not going to be as high. So what does that look like? What are the so okay, what does that look like in sort of practice, right? The magnitude of the forces are basically how much you are interacting with the ground. So if you activate your hip musculature and press down into the ground harder with your back leg, that will increase the magnitude of the ground action forces, which can increase the moments about the body center mass. Having a longer, more extended back leg, that will increase the moment and arm distance, right? And then the angle part, it's really the manner through which you are, the direction through which you are pressing into the ground. So to me, that's like very much a motor control, a skill element of moment application. And the idea is, and here's one very important thing. A lot of times in biomechanics, especially when we apply a mechanical model or performing a mechanical analysis to understand the fundamental principles that govern the way the athletes move in specific sporting movements, we're describing what's happening from a mechanical perspective. This is exactly the same as the models of correction forces in sprinting. Just because something happens from a mechanical perspective in sprinting does not mean we need to use that exactly to cue how an athlete should move. Okay? There's a big difference between understanding the fundamentals of what's happening and trying to implement a change in practice. And this is one very important thing to understand. It's not like no, the biomechanics are gonna sit here and be like, okay, as an athlete, here's where I want you to apply, ground action forces in order for you to have more rotations. It's not as simple as that. And to be frank, even if it's as simple as that, my experiences in professional pitching, the professional baseball, tells me even anything like this is not really being explored by like except for like maybe one club. So there's an important piece of like, okay, if you're a researcher working with forces, if you care about ground action forces, these are the fundamental mechanics you need to know. Okay? And if you don't have a good grasp of fundamental mechanics, you're not going to be able to understand how and why exactly things are happening that way. If you're going to spend so much money investing in a lab, buying force plates, you better understand what the forces are doing to the body's movement. I think that's a very bare minimum perspective. Or maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm crazy. Just a little bit. All right, let's talk about figures. Dang, I made these in PowerPoint. I'm not gonna lie. Like a lot of the figures I started off in MATLAB made these all normalized to body weight of different impulses generated in different directions. At least in the captions, I explain what those directions mean, which is great. And then we have the impulses for the angular perspective made in PowerPoint. Nowadays, I try to make it look much prettier. Times New Roman makes everything looks much more professional, and obviously you need a higher resolution, right? And oh, a lot of tables. What's funny about this is like sometimes you feel like you're shoehorning in statistical tests for no reason, just to say, oh wow, look how big the results are, and that is the purpose. But sometimes people get so picky about the exact statistical procedure without understanding the inherent limitations in those statistical tests. It's like, okay, you have a significant difference. Like, for example, something like this, right? If you have such a clear difference in what each leg is doing, like your impulse generation are in completely different directions because they are, mechanical phenomena. So you're trying to capture it statistically. Yeah, of course you're going to see a significant difference. Like, but that's not meaningful at all. It's not helpful. Okay. What's really helpful is that when you're trying to distinguish things that are at least close enough, in which case statistical tests can help you better understand or better appreciate the differences, whether or how likely or not the differences you're seeing is actually real or not. But yeah, talking about the statistics, you know, sample size aside, I mean, one person reviewed this paper at a Baseball Biomechanics Society Journal Club, and all they were harping on was the sample size, and nothing was mentioned about the mechanics, which to me is like, yeah, there's a reason we have the world's longest, not the world's longest title, but like, come on now. This is a very long title, goes into 4 lines. And we say, oh, preliminary findings. All right, everybody calm down. Jesus. It's only 4 people, but let's talk about the mechanics, right? Anyone else gonna try to look at the mechanics of this? No? We don't think rotation generation and pitching at the whole body level is important? Maybe a little bit? Anyway, but yeah, people harp on sample size so much. I'm like, yes. Depending on the research question, sample size matters a lot more sometimes than others. If it's more methods focused, then I personally, especially even when I'm reviewing other papers, I'm like, hey, state your limitations. Everybody's gonna be like, limitation one, sample size. Great, let's move on, right? It's about how much you can take away from the study. So, but anyway, this paper was the review process for sports biomechanics was surprisingly nice, and that was actually the only time that the reviewing process was surprisingly nice with sports biomechanics. 'Cause after that, every single one of my experiences with this journal has been moving on. So this paper was done. Still have no idea who the reviewers are. I just remember one of my committee members and I hope good friend, Christoph Kipp, gave me a very cryptic smile at the next International Society of Biomechanics Sport and Conference in Liverpool. I was like, yeah, your paper is doing pretty good. But that was the full story, really. After very quite a lot of rejections, at least from my perspective, but I guess that's just research writing in general. Like in academia, you're almost always going to have people that's being really picky and research don't see the point of it, don't see the purpose. And what's funny is like you just keep shooting, right? But instead of like keep shooting the same shot on the same hoop like you would in a basketball game, you're just moving to a different hoop, by submitting to a different journal. And hopefully the hoop is nicer, it's not as crooked, right? And the ball fits. So yeah, sample size is small. Yeah, it's just, whatever. It's the thing I care about the least. Oh yeah, and this research was actually one of the projects that was in our lab, sponsored by Major League Baseball. Even though the progress is so slow because that's just the way research are. But yeah, it's the pro. This is the that's much. That's it for the paper. This is still to date because this is my first paper. It was published in 2022. It has the most citations of all of my papers, but obviously it's not my best work. It's just my first work. It still has a special place in my heart. And thanks to all of these, collaborators that helped me in this journey. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This one was a trip down memory lane. I didn't review too much on the specific paper aspect, but I wanted to tell the story of what's happening around scientific publications. So I hope it's at the minimum entertaining. And hopefully in a future rendition, I probably won't do this every week because I'm going to run out of my papers very quickly. But every once in a while, I'll do a self paper review slash story time. And yeah, let me know what questions you might have. And please go check out this paper. My ResearchGate profile has all of my publications there. So, all right.